Hello and welcome to the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you will find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Well, it is that time once again, believe it or not, and we are launching our Academy Awards coverage today. Right before the holidays, the Academy released the short list of 10 films to be considered in the Best Sound category. And I'm happy to report that 5 of those films have already appeared on this podcast with their sound teams talking about the extraordinary work that's gone into some of the tracks this year. We're hoping to bring as many of these films to this podcast as possible in the coming weeks. Today, we are discussing the harrowing new adaptation of the classic novel of World War I, All Quiet on the Western Front. The film is notable in that it is the first ever German language adaptation of the book made by German filmmakers, and it has an appropriately incredible Dolby Atmos mix, which you can experience in the Netflix app if you watch it with the German language track enabled. We will have a link, as always, in our show notes. Joining us today is the film's writer and director, Edward Berger, co-sound designers Frank Kruse and Markus Stemler, re-recording mixer Lars Ginzel, and production sound mixer Viktor Prášil. So as I said, this film has been shortlisted for the Academy Award for Best Sound. And as the director, Edward Berger, says in the interview, this team has quite the pedigree when it comes to sound awards in Germany. And it is an incredible honor for a foreign language film to be shortlisted for the Best Sound Academy Award. So it was a great pleasure for me to have this team on the show today to talk about the film. So I started off the conversation by asking Edward, the writer and director, why he wanted to tackle this project and why he felt it was an ideal time to do so.
Well, I got a call from my good friend and producer, Malte Grunert, about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and he asked me if I were interested in making this film. And I immediately responded viscerally, almost physically, with an urge to say yes. Yeah, because it's the book is, and I realized, even though I had forgotten, I actually was angry that I hadn't thought of this myself, that I needed a bloody producer to come up with the idea. So, and I thought, like, why didn't I think of this? And but I immediately thought this could be really interesting. It could be a major challenge, and it could be very interesting because the book is has been within me for decades. And I've read it a couple times, and then I read it again for writing and prep. And I realized how much it was within me, and that it's somehow part of our DNA in a way. It's a part of our cultural heritage. And I did feel, besides probably an incredible amount of idiocy in hindsight, but that there was an American film made before, and that this was different because we grew up in Germany. And we grew up differently from American filmmakers or British filmmakers who usually get to make these films. And they get to make it with their heritage. And their heritage is so different from ours. You're born in America. Your country was roped into wars by Europe twice. And sort of you liberated Europe from fascism in the Second World War. And that leaves a very different feeling in your gut, within your ancestors. And they hand that down to you. They hand that DNA down to you. There's a sense of honor about it, a sense of pride, maybe. But looking back, and you celebrate those people that helped that cause. And in Germany, there's nothing to celebrate. There's nothing to be proud of. There's nothing to. There's no honor in it. There's just a sense of shame or guilt or responsibility towards that history. And it felt important to me to make a movie where we make decisions, every day we make decisions that inform that movie. And those decisions are sort of formed by how we grew up, about how we are. And I thought, if we let how we grow up, if we let those feelings inside of us inform those decisions, ideally in the end we'll have a very different movie than an American or British movie, and it might be interesting to add to that dialogue, you know, to add to that genre. And that was a big reason why I thought we could make this film now. And then also there was a rising sense of nationalism around the world, in America, in England, in Europe, right-wing parties being voted into office. And I suddenly heard speech on the street, and especially in parliaments, but that trickles down to the street, that I thought they used last in Germany in the 30s, probably. And I felt scared by that. And I thought it might be the right time to make a film about where that led to 100 years ago.
It's a great point. And I especially, I appreciate what you were saying about that it's, in Germany, it's nothing to be proud of, and it's a shameful episode. But at the same time, I think that you unlocked this empathy and sympathy by focusing on the boys in the trenches and establishing a contrast between them and the generals and the government officials. And I want to talk more about that as we get into the conversation about sound. But there's so many moments in this sound and in the film that are so brilliantly set up for sound. And I was curious, so Edward, when you were writing the script, were you hearing the sound of the film as you were writing? Because so many of the moments that you shot and set up in the film seem like they are perfectly lending themselves to really creative sound work.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I've been wanting to work with the sound team for ages, and somehow they never were available. And, you have to know that I would call them the Meryl Streep of the German sound designers. They have been nominated and mixers. They have been nominated so many times for German film awards. It's ridiculous. You know? It's probably 25 times or so. I lost count. And you try to get them, and then they never have time, or they're on more ambitious projects or so. And so I thought this time around, maybe I can entice them to come and board this film, because it's challenging enough. And and I had geeked out on a lot of conversation. Whenever I meet Frank at events or so, I steer towards him and I say, like, you know what? I really want to make a sound in mono one day, because there's this movie called Downhill Racer with Robert Redford. And I remember watching, and the sound is so precise and focused on the skis, yeah, and on the tissues that he rips out of the. And Frank told me, well, it's because it's mono. You know, it's really that one sound source, and it's so silent and still. And so I'm a very big stickler for clear sound effects and precise sound and feeling, and it has an immense emotional effect on the audience and on me, and hopefully on the audience. And so while I was shooting it, it's not only it's on every level, or planning it on every level. The film is very much about contrast too. You mentioned the generals and the soldiers. That's thematically, that's one. But there's also between destruction and peace, noise and silence, a battle and exhaustion, wide shots and close-ups, so darkness and light. So a lot of it is in contrast. And I love abrupt sound cuts, really hard sound cuts, because they always shake me awake in the movie theater. I always go, oh God, something changed. And I have to change pace and I have to listen up. And so we had talked about and thought a lot about before about those contrasts and those hard sound cuts that lend themselves to a rich design, I think.
Yeah. Well, Frank and Markus, can you talk a little bit about your initial impressions of the film? Did Edward show you a script before he went out and shot, or at what point in the process did you all get involved?
Yeah, Edward sent me a script, I think about a year before they started shooting, I believe, a first draft. And I started reading it. I was pretty excited about it. And then I realized we were still in the first battle when I was on page 60. And I thought, like, oh my God, this thing is going to be massive. And yeah, and then it changed more to a more narrative version later, and I knew what was coming, and then COVID hit pretty hard, and yeah, so I immediately anticipated that on this film we wouldn't have a chance to like go on set and capture extra sounds, because I know that the production sound mixer is super busy, with focus on dialogue, etc., getting that as clean as possible. And usually on other films, Markus and myself, we would go on set even during the shoot is still ongoing, and then to take some strain off the production sound crew and record whatever we can grab on set, like mostly focused on crowd, historical vehicles, obviously, especially on this one. So I knew that wouldn't be possible on this film. So I had an early on conversation with Viktor, who was then was asked to come on as a production sound mixer, and was really relieved and excited to find out that he had worked through the script as well, just like myself, taking notes, which scenes would be very important to grab the original dirt and mud and wet, and basically all the original grit that is so important to bring home from set to make the sound work and keep it alive, and not kind of reconstruct everything in retrospect by just getting rid of all the production, whatever's not dialogue, just throw it all out and then reconstruct everything from scratch. So that's not something I really look forward to on films like this, because since the film and what came later in camera was so detailed and so like analog in a way, there were so many effects that were done in camera and was so inspiring. We wanted to really to have that kind of original, all the mud and the grit and the original feel. And so I talked to Viktor, and we flagged all the important sounds, like the crowd, and was, like I said, I was really glad that he had kind of the same idea, and he brought in extra personnel, but maybe he will tell that story himself, like to capture these sounds with the focus on crowd, like people, like the screams and everything, and the original vehicles. We really, I asked him to just grab as much as he can and bring that home from set, because we just knew COVID would prevent anyone from outside to step on that set during the shoot.
Well, Viktor, that really kind of queued up a question that I have for you. This looks like it was a very difficult film to shoot. Obviously, Frank talked about the mud and the grit and the dirt. You really got a sense of the horrible conditions in the trenches for these guys. And of course, I'm watching the film thinking the horrible conditions for the production sound mixer as well to capture in those circumstances. And I'm sure those period vintage costumes were quite noisy as well. And there were lots of munitions and pyrotechnics going off. So Viktor, can you talk about the process of capturing the production sound and how you were able to get as clean a recordings as you did?
Well, the battle scenes were really challenging, but we had a good idea from the pre-production what to expect. Pre-production was extremely important to us, especially the cooperation with the costume department. We did a couple of tests during the costume fittings to find the right place where to put radios. That was crucial thing. We also knew from James Friend, the DOP, that he would be using wide lenses, and everything will be in motion. So we had to be 100% sure with our radio mics. So every actor from the main group was wearing 2 radio mics, one in costume and one in helmet. There were several reasons for that. One of the reasons was dynamic range. The actors were going from whispering to screaming in one take. So each of the radios would set the different sensitivity. And the another reason was because the actors were crawling or running or pointing a gun. So the microphone in the costume wasn't always usable, unfortunately. And what we knew from the beginning was the bread is absolutely essential for us and for the movie. I would say as important as the dialogue, because the bread completely drives you into the action, and helmets were essential in this because we could get really close with the microphone and actors can turn their head and it was still there. They could do everything what they wanted and it worked great, I would say. And about the location, that was crazy. Yeah. Incredible muddy, and it was difficult just to move around the set. Many times we were stuck in the mud. People were losing their shoes there. Like, really? I've never seen that before. So big thanks to all my crew, because it was extremely physical demanding, you know. But the advantage of the location was that we shot in a former military area, military training centers. So there was no traffic, no people, no civilians, no planes flying, but that was because the pandemic. But how we did deal with the noisy scenes and during the entire shooting, and what I really appreciate was the number of wall tracks we recorded. We did a lot of them, like really a lot. After each scene, we decided with Edward if we needed to record something or not. Edward was completely open to do it. He even directed extras on set during the wall tracks or doing some follies himself. It was incredible. So it was a great collaboration with him, and without his passion for sound, we would never have made such a good sound on set, I would say.
You just cannot get these sounds again. You know, we had sometimes 250, 350 extras rushing across the field shouting hooray, yeah, about you know, being able to go into battle. You know? And I wanted that sound. And I knew I'm not going to get 350 extras to shout it on a field in Berlin with Frank. You know, yes, we can loop it and, you know, do crowd recordings with 20 people, but it was a different feeling. And I wanted really to get that. It's almost like getting the shot, you know, get that wild track. You will never get it again. And it'll always be in this film. And so we really wanted to take advantage of those moments and capture it, like also with the vehicles that Frank mentioned. There's not many vehicles in Europe from 1917 that still drive. And we had 4 of them. So we needed to record them because we weren't going to get them back.
Yeah, Frank. So did you have a wish list that you asked Viktor and his team to get for you of those of vehicles and whatnot?
The wish list was pretty simple. It was just get everything you can, you know, literally, everything that's possible, everything that's interesting. Even what I really love about love to preserve in films like these are like even the mistakes, the so-called, like something that we would call like, you know, unusable sound is super important to get these, you know, get close to the characters when they fall into the mud, have the, you know, even have the microphone bumping into the dirt and stuff like that. It makes it really visceral and like gets the audience into the action, because this film is so much about, you know, moving from first person perspective to an observer and back. So even getting all that stuff in there, even the mistakes was important, but this thing was really wild track paradise, I must say. Like Edward said, all the vehicles were captured in multi-tracks, you know, high sample rates, etc. Everything was there. These huge crowd recordings with multiple microphones, surround mics, extra booms at the same time, plus lavs, etc. So I don't know, Markus, do you want to? I think you counted them at some point. It was a crazy number.
I was so impressed by what we received from set. And so the library, I can't remember a movie we've worked on where we received such an extensive library of wire tracks. Actually, it was maybe close to 400 or something. And then, apart from the wire tracks, even every take was gold for us, because before or after or during the take, there were always snippets which might not have ended up in the actual edit, but for us sound-wise, there were lots of snippets that had so much character and sparked ideas for us. Some of them we've used as elements. Other ones were just brought us further in thinking about how things could sound, and the sheer load of material was huge. And for us it was the perfect starting point, actually.
I wanted to ask you about that because Edward, you mentioned that you had a very small number of authentic period vehicles that you had access to, and obviously these events happened over 100 years ago. So what was your process for approaching the various kinds of munitions, ordnance, the actual war sounds that the guys are hearing in the field? And obviously, I'm sure not much of that stuff exists anymore. So how did you even have a sense of what the guys had experienced in 1917, 1918? And how did you approach recreating it?
Well, for us, it was very important, not just for sound, but for every department, to really get into the main character's head and express, in this case with sound, what he might at any moment feel, and make that palpable, make that visceral, make that physical for the audience. And that has a lot to do with, making it subjective. The perspective is really important. To creep into his head and have the bullets fly around his head, have them pan from left to right and past him, and obviously there's very little records of what existed, but we didn't want to, and I'll let Frank and Markus speak to it, we didn't want to fall back on tropes or cliches that have been used a lot, like certain bullet types, or the typical one I would say is you get into an explosion and then afterwards your ear beeps, you have tinnitus. So we avoided those things, but we tried to, let's say that, for example, there's a bomb attack on a bunker and the bunker collapses. And afterwards, it becomes incredibly silent. And we just hear like wet earth trickling. And it's what the thing that Paul Bäumer, who's lying in this darkness, our hero, is lying in this darkness underneath the earth. And he's this is what he hears. That's what's closest to his ear. And so we imagine that. We try to imagine, what does the main character hear? Obviously, no one knows what the explosion sounded, but we try to get sounds that sort of capture an older feeling, and yet are very, an attack on the senses as well. While that was also really important to us, preserving a sense of poetry once in a while, with the nature shots, for example, to create a sense of relief and a sense of yearning also, of what we're losing, of where we try to get back to. I mean, the movie starts with a shot of foxes, young cubs, sucking on teats on a mother's on a fox mom's teats and drinking milk, and that's sort of the origin where we try to get back to, right? What we lose in this movie, and we're always yearning. I wish I were there, and I wish it was warm, and I wish I were protected with mom, like as a baby. And the sense of family, sense of warmth, and sense of belonging. And we lose that throughout the film, that the characters lose it. And once in a while, there are echoes of that with the nature shots. There's a big scene where Paul falls into a crater and kills a Frenchman, and sort of discovers that he's become a killing machine and that he sees his soul dying in front of him. And at the end of that scene, he wakes up out of the stupor and he hears birds sing. And for me, what are the birds called? Swift birds or swallows, I think. They're sort of swifts. They're summer. For me, they're the sound. That's the sound of summer. And this is the winter of 1918. So probably one of the worst winters in the last in the last centuries. And there was with a lot of bloodshed and a lot of 17 million people have died. And yet this boy wakes up and sort of hears the sound of summer and the sound of peace and in the middle of all this battle. And these little sounds to create a sense of relief and create a sense of what this character yearns for it was very important to us.
Very well said. And I think it's a good time for us to queue up the first of the clips that we received from Netflix to take a listen to. This is our main character, Paul, that we've discussed. In this particular sequence, he and his group get the order to leave their trench and to charge across the kind of nomad's land, and they enter into the French trench and start to have hand-to-hand combat with the French soldiers. So we'll take a listen to this clip. Lars, I would love to hear from your perspective about mixing the sequence together and how because obviously there's just such a tremendous amount going on. But in the spirit of what Edward was saying when we first started, I love the sense of directionality and clarity and focus. I feel like maybe in this mix, more than anything else, you were subtracting rather than adding.
Yes, absolutely. It's I don't know. I'm sure we've raised a couple of elements here and there, but like I would say 90% of the time during the final, we just try to find those elements that would make a real difference and subtract those. So one thing, for instance, especially in those bigger battle sequences that we found out after a while was because Frank and Markus had several layers of fighting sounds of guns and crowds shouting, and so there was these helped to create a sense of density, or also in terms of depth of field and all of that. But having one certain layer of those gunshots, which was actually the furthest away, or not having it would make a tremendous difference about how much of that battle you could actually take. And in a sense, because you also asked about like, okay, how did we approach like recreating the reality of those battles? In a sense, the density of everything, it was not. We had an urge to try to make it sort of pay tribute to what those soldiers reported back to their families in letters. But one of the things that we noticed during the mix that was even more important was like, how do we keep it bearable for the audience? And that's why subtracting was so hugely important to find that one element that would just break the line or just be the last drip of water, and then the bucket would overflow. And so that's like a lot of subtraction and just finding the right beats and the right passages of just taking one layer out, and then it would be just feel like, okay, that's just about right.
I was amazed, Lars, when we went into the mix and I sat in the back and there's probably 200 tracks open or something, and well, I don't know how many, it already seems like a lot, and it's just a mess. I mean, it's already really well organized, but it's just too loud and too many things happen at once. And then to sort of in this really diligent process of selecting the right sounds, and with Frank and Markus having the right instinct of where they want to steer this scene emotionally, then slowly it became sort of the sculpture that Lars chipped away at, and then in the end, there's sort of you have this thing there. But it took every scene it basically, I felt, revisited a little bit about like in the shoot, where I went in the morning to set, and I thought, oh God, we're going to have to go through the mud again today and get all of these shots. And we're never, ever going to get them. And we're never, ever going to get this done. This is exactly what I thought each morning in the mix before each scene, where I thought, how are we going to find we're never, ever going to find the right sound, And then slowly, bit by bit, Lars and Frank and Markus chiseled away at it and revealed this beautiful thing underneath.
I think one of the other things that was that's sticking out to me in terms of the mix and the character of the film, or the film soundtrack, is really that we try to keep things distinct. So, and also in terms of the dynamics of the film, it's not just that we go from loud to low to quiet, and there's a lot of shifts of density and often and also in terms of spatial width. So there are a couple of scenes which are really basic and very, very narrow, very quiet and concentrated. But then there are also quiet scenes that are wide, because there's some wind moving and there's just one element coming from the side. And then again, it becomes overwhelming, and it's this mass of everything. But even in the mass of everything, we try to keep the focus for the audience to have something to hang on to. Because we want to guide the audience in a way that it's still, they can follow what Paul and his friends are going through in those battle scenes.
By the way, the sound design also created an immense amount of scale to the movie. In essence, we are very often in a trench. Yes, we're running across a battlefield in the big wide shots, but very often we are on faces of actors in small places and in confined places. And I just remember, for example, the effect the crowd recording had on me. When on set, I probably didn't even, but because a lot of the actors, the smaller actors were Czech, and they didn't have the right accent in German. And I knew they were going to be off camera, so I knew, okay, I can record this guy in Berlin. And we really had to be diligent with where we would spend the money. So I'm not going to fly in an actor for a line that is off camera, barely audible, So shouting some command. So there's there's a command off camera, and maybe this guy was properly a German with a proper accent so that we could use it. But then Frank and Markus recorded so many crowds that passed on this one command down the trench for it felt like a kilometer, like 600, 800, 1,000 yards. You felt like, okay, the command is passed, and you suddenly, from the face of an actor, you felt he was standing in a trench that was a kilometer long.
When we talk about the sound for this film, it's easy to focus on the battle sequences and the big major kind of set pieces like that. But there were so many. You've all talked about dynamic range, but some of my favorite sound moments in this movie are very quiet and very specific. After that first battle sequence in the trench, when Paul is walking along and he steps on what turns out to be his friend's glasses. When I heard that crunch and then I saw the next shot is the glasses lying in the mud, immediately I knew what had happened. And it was just I had such an emotional response that was triggered by that sound. I thought that was just a genius moment. And then, the night when they're driving they're being driven to the front, and it's very tense. And Edward, you stage that in a wide shot on the road with all these vehicles, and one by one they turn off their headlights as they get closer to the front so that they won't get shot at. But it's a very simple scene, but we just hear each vehicle turning off its lights. And to me, that's just very powerful storytelling through sound.
I'm so glad you noticed those. And those sounds are sometimes too loud for what they realistically would be. Obviously, headlights turning off don't have a sound. And those glasses, I remember us talking, it's pretty loud for a pair of glasses in the mud, like it's almost like a window breaking. But it's just to Paul, that's the sound that Paul, it goes through his bones.
That's really the thing we try to chase, like to constantly think about, whose perspective are we currently in? Like, are we with Paul coming out of the rubble of the bunker, and then like after having this hearing loss moment, like having his hearing actually heightened. So this tiny glass sound becomes, a little bit larger than life, but just this tiny bit to keep it naturalistic as well. For most of the time, this is kind of I think a key idea for the soundtrack on this film, to not have it. There are very few moments that are actually designy in a way, designy in a artificial way. We obviously create all these like hearing, like these bubble moments acoustically, but they're always kind of based on, I would say, simplistic idea, not let's say like naturalistic ideas for sounds that we use and how we use them in the film, without becoming like overly, drenching everything in reverb and all these tricks of the trade that we all know. And so, yeah, that's kind of that was a kind of a path we try to follow on this one.
Another one of my favorite sound moments comes after the German soldiers storm the French trench, and they find all this amazing food, and they're so starved. Edward, you take us on such a roller coaster of emotions through this film. There's been a very, very visceral hand-to-hand combat in the trench, then almost a lighthearted moment when the German soldiers find all this food and they start to gorge themselves. And then my favorite sound moment, one of my favorites in the film, when we start to hear the rumbling of the French tanks that are coming, and that wonderful shot with all the rats disappearing. And then the French tanks show up. So can you talk, Frank and Markus, about building that particular sequence when the French tanks show up, and Lars about mixing it, please?
When they enter the kitchen, they're really grabbing all the food they can find, and it was actually a great Foley job. You hear lots of Foley then, and it really makes it real. And then all of a sudden the rumble starts, and at that point of the story, these soldiers had not yet faced tanks of that size, so they didn't really know where all the rumble was coming from. And so they leave this sort of field kitchen in a hurry and line up in the trenches. And for us, sound-wise, we thought about how we could support that, mystery, so to speak, because as I said, they didn't know where this was coming from. So we had the choice of either creating this big wall of engine sounds of a tank division approaching, but then we thought it would be more interesting to focus just on the effect that these tanks had. So as you mentioned, the vibration, the shaking, and these rats. And I think we also added like little jumping pebble stones when we are seeing them lining up in the trenches. Although we don't see the stones jumping, but it added the feeling that they had. And then, so the idea really was to go with them in terms of like keeping the mystery up, and then just when these tanks appear at the horizon, that's where we finally start hearing them. All before, it's also like rather ominous sounds that echo through the fog, so it's kind of mirroring what they see because they didn't really see the tanks. So we try to mirror that in the sound, and then once the tanks show up, then all hell breaks loose, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, this probably also goes back to your question about how accurate can you be in such a film? You know, who knows how stuff sounded back then, etc. But pretty early on, we decided to not approach this challenge by trying to be ultimately scientifically accurate, to have the exact proper gunshot, the exact grenade impact, the exact tank sound of that time, because in the emotion of these scenes, you always want to be, you know, tell the story from the emotional point of view. It doesn't really help that scene, for example, that you mentioned, if you had the ultimate 100% super accurate sound of the belt drives, you know, grinding, or the engine sound, etc. So we just wanted these tanks to become these iron monsters, kind of referring to the war machinery that was ongoing, and the soldiers being these characters trying to avoid becoming the very soil they were wading through, you know, and all that was a kind of the idea and the approach behind the sound. And to always think about the emotion in these scenes, and less about, you know, is this really the absolute accurate engine from 1918 at the right RPM, etc. That's in other films that's totally fine, but in this one it felt kind of wrong to chase down that road. And then in the end, who knows, you know, what war really sounds from, especially when you're in that extreme situation.
In that whole sequence with the tanks approaching, I think at least once they come out of that bunker with all the food, another element that starts changing everything is the music that kicks in, and that was a big challenge during the mix, finding the right way of how to integrate music and sound effects with each other, because we have this low rumble, and also the music starts on a very ominous note. So everything blends quite easily with each other, which is fine for a while. But once, like Markus said, hell breaks loose, then it was really important to have a sense of separation between music and the sound effects, because otherwise you're losing the beat of the music, and once you lose that, then you sort of really lose the music, or you have to push it too hard. And so that was a very delicate balance, and actually a delicate transition of finding the right levels of how to set this up, so we don't end up louder and everything than necessary.
Lars mentions a point about these tanks and the music kicking in. A big theme was also the war machine, the relentless machine that just doesn't stop. And so the music sort of intonates, or sort of tries to capture that essence of the tank that will just go. And even if there's a body in front, it'll just drive over it. And no bullet can stop it. It'll just continue to go. This spaceship basically just plows through human life. And so a lot of the times we try to find sounds that, you know, sort of capture this feeling of the machine, the grinding machine, the machinery that moves forward and just is unstoppable and won't halt in front of, especially will gobble up this youth and innocence that these kids bring to the trenches.
It's that realization with the music that we had one day when Volker Bertelmann, the composer, was in the mix, that we had to keep the beat element, which is really relentless in a way. We had to keep that alive and prominent in a way, to make the whole cue work and to make the whole scene work and whole fit together much better. So that was also a great collaboration with the composer coming in and sitting with us and just watching the film and discussing how we can improve the overall, and that was just really, really good to have that.
I'm glad you brought this up, because I made a note that I wanted to ask you all about Volker Bertelmann's score. It's not at all what I was kind of expecting for a war movie set in 1918. Certainly in terms of instrumentation, it's a really arresting and interesting score. So, Edward, maybe if you could start just kind of, what were your conversations with Volker about the approach to the score, and what you needed him to accomplish, and then how did the score fit into Frank and Markus's sound design?
I basically told him 3 or 4 things. I showed him the movie, and I said, the first thing was like, please give me a soundtrack that I've never heard before, because I know when I suddenly, what it can add to a movie. It can elevate it to a completely different field, and it can give it a completely different feeling. This movie with strings would have had a completely different effect on the audience. So that was one thing, like something unexpected and that we haven't heard before. The next thing was destroy the images. Don't beautify it, but just sort of work against them and destroy. I mean, I really said destroy them. And that was the best, that was the only thing I could say. And he understood that cryptic message for some reason. And then the third, again, comes back to the character. Let's not sentimentalize or over-emotionalize. Let's try to find the sound that is in Paul Bäumer's stomach, what he feels in his gut at any given moment. And let's try to find a note for that. And Volker went home and thought about it. And actually 2 days later, he sent me a little clip, an MPEG or MOF or whatever you call it. And he said, and there was this 3-tone theme was on it, the do, 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 these 3 sounds. And the first cue, actually, he had done. And I immediately felt that it was, and that was the basis for the movie, for the entire soundtrack. We based it all on these 3 sounds, and he sent it after 2 days. And I felt it sounded almost like Led Zeppelin. And I really liked that. And it was actually a harmonium that he had inherited great-great-grandmother, and that he sort of refurbished and put through a Marshall amp. So it's a very analog recording, not electronic, but it sounds electronic. It sounds like, Einstürzende Neubauten, that kind of destruction of sound or deconstruction of sound that he used. And so the harmonium is an instrument also that you pump air into with your knees and your feet. It's like a piano, but you pump air into it, and you hear the insides of this instrument, the crackling, the pump of it, the breath, the breathing, and that became part of the theme too. The breathing, the machinery of this instrument sort of helped, bring that theme across that we always thought of the war machine.
There's a good example for that as well, for these, let's say, extra sounds that Volker provided through this instrument is the uniform montage at the beginning, where we see the uniforms being recycled and the kind of the circle, the endless circle of, uniforms being put on the next batch of soldiers being sent to the front. So there's this undercurrent of the rhythm of the harmonium underneath that sequence, which kind of circles back to Edward's idea of the war machinery, where he asked us to find like a sonic representation of that machinery, the factories and the heavy iron mills creating all this machinery for the war, and have a representation on the sound side. So there's this pumping like steel mill sound underneath that's combined with Volker's music over that sequence, over the sewing machines and stuff like that. So there's also a very we had a couple of conversations with Volker where we tried to work back and forth a couple of ideas, kind of blending sound design and music into each other and kind of creating like a third thing from both sides. So there was a good amount of collaboration in that area as well, which was really kind of, it's really what this film is kind of a standout for me, because the whole collaboration throughout the entire team in amongst our department and the production sound mixer, Viktor, and even Edward, picturing him fighting for getting all these wild tracks and crowd on set. It's just it's very unique experience, this film, and I think it all adds to what it became in the end. It was really kind of rewarding, I must say.
Yeah, very much so. And I appreciate the conversation about the war machine and kind of how that actually dovetails in the Sound of War. Frank, you brought up the sewing machine, that factory sequence. And I mean, Edward, you were talking before about hard cuts and sound and how that kind of jars the viewer. But one of the things that I noticed was the amazing use of sound and sound design as a transition element. And I loved, there was that particular sequence I made note of with the factory sewing machines that then becomes the machine gun sounds on the field. And then that becomes like the one of the truck engines. Like you guys, you were very poetic about your use of sound as well, not just hard cuts.
Thank you. Well, I accept the thanks on behalf of the sound crew.
That's probably the only sequence where Edward was really looking for a smooth, almost like a morph or transition that you described to the truck. Otherwise, it was pretty hard cut. Otherwise,
there was also that transition to the first battlefield, like which is basically just from the trees onto the battlefield, and it seems so super simple now. And I think, I don't know, we did 5 or 6 versions of that because Edward was never quite satisfied. There was something like in the really like micro timing of how things blend that really just needed to find its place. So it really shows like how precise Edward's imagination is already about something, how he wants things, which is the real key that helps us do our job the way we do it, and with the I don't know, with the degree of precision that we try to put into it. It's that precise idea that he's able to bring to us. That's the key.
That's great. Well, you guys have been very generous with your time. Before I let you go, I just have one sort of final question, which is, Frank, you were saying that you and Edward earlier on were having discussion about the power of mono in Downhill Racer, but happily for us on this podcast, this movie is not in mono. You were natively working in Dolby Atmos through the beginning and all the way through the process. So my final question for all of you is about Dolby Atmos. What storytelling possibilities did that unlock for you? And what are your favorite Atmos moments in the film?
This film is so Dolby Atmos like almost no movie before that I worked on, because there's so many reasons to use Atmos in this film, starting with grenades flying in from overhead, then the bunker scene where stuff is actually coming down on the soldiers from above, and all those moments, and then the sound transitions that we create in those, like the sound bubble moment during the tank attack where he sees his comrade die. That's just, everything's just, there's so many moments where stuff is rotating like crazy around, and with really, thanks to the full range surrounds especially, there's so much freedom to play and with positioning without stuff becoming like essentially like speaker phones in the surrounds. To keep the fidelity going is like really key to creating this immersive soundscape that is not distracting at the same time. Just because something moves to the side walls of the theater, it doesn't change the fidelity so much. So it doesn't pull you out as a technical gimmick in a way. So yeah, it was really, I mean, Atmos was a godsend on this one. So yeah, it's quite the opposite of mono, even though some scenes are quite mono, I must say, but it's all about like, it brings us back to the idea of doing contrast. Nothing's more boring than doing the same thing the whole time. So create contrast. So Atmos was of great help for that.
There's a scene where the headmaster gives a speech in the beginning. And I remember we spent a long time mixing that because the camera is on a tower cam and it does a 360-degree pan while it goes down. While it cranes down, it does a 360-degree pan and ends up on the speaker. And we wanted to be, again, truthful to the perspective and do what sort of where Paul is in this mass. And so where he hears this speech from. And so we started out panning it from all the way on the left to all the way through every speaker in the back, and then all the way on the right, and then ending up in the front, like with the movement of the camera in sync. And that just became a bit after, like we did probably 5 versions of that, and doing more, doing less. And then we decided in the end, it's a bit too gimmicky, and we left a lot left and right and just put very little in the back, or nothing. In the end, we cut Atmos. I'm sorry, we cut the back. But again, it's about, taking, and it's experimenting with that and having that opportunity of having the possibility to do it in the back, and then realizing, for this shot, it doesn't quite work, but for the next shot where someone speaks or where the bullets need to fly, we really need to make use of that. So it was a really interesting journey of and mixing experience, that scene.
I think that's exactly the point. It gives you a wider range of contrast in many aspects, like in terms of loudness, in terms of width, in terms of density, and that's why it's been such a given that we could use the whole palette of what was available and then just choose the right amount for each moment, like Edward said. And in that moment with the headmaster, the right amount was just keeping it on the front and give it a little bit of shift left and right. But in other moments, no, that's not what we need. We need the full spin. So I think that was, for me, that was really the big advantage of mixing it in Dolby Atmos and really doing the theatrical mix. That's what we first did, and that was all we focused on, and then taking it down the line afterwards.
What was maybe also special about mixing in Atmos on this film was because the way the story is told is so subjective. We're focusing during the battle. The camera is focusing for long stretches on just Paul. So a lot of the battle activity had to happen off screen because the battle still needs to go on. And so therefore Atmos was perfect because while we were focusing on Paul in the front, in the center, everything else had to happen. And but of course we wanted to avoid to muddy everything up. So therefore it was just gold really to make that work.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Dolby podcast. It was a real pleasure. First of all, watching the film. It's extraordinary work. And as I said, an amazing honor for you all to be on the Best Sound shortlist for the Academy Awards. So congratulations and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Victor,
so much.
Lars, Frank, Edward, Markus, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks once again to Edward, Frank, Markus, Lars, and Viktor. And many thanks again to our friends at Netflix who helped us put this conversation together with all these folks from a continent away and provided us with those clips. As I mentioned up top, All Quiet on the Western Front is currently streaming on Netflix in stunning Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. As always, we will have a link for you in our show notes. Before you go, I'd like to remind you to please make sure you're subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. With awards season heating up, you can expect many more episodes just like this one in case you need a little help filling out your Oscar ballot. If you happen to be an Academy voter, or if you just want to do a little better in your annual office pool. You can find a link to our show on all the major platforms in our show notes, or just search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thanks again for joining us. This is the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with production support by Taylor Hines, and our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thanks again for listening.